Cindy. It's a pleasure to do this with you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for making the time to come join us today. So I think at this point, the whole pandemic thing is a little old. But what is interesting, sort of looking a year back, is comparing, what we had expected potentially a year back to what the reality on the ground was. So we did a survey, we ran a survey which we call ADAPT internally here at Topia. This involved about 1,200 respondents with companies just like yourselves, global companies or companies globally, global companies globally. And this is what we saw, what we learned is the expectation that HR professionals had. So about 93% of HR professionals were confident that they knew where a majority of their employees were working in the pandemic over the last 12 to 15 months. And 78% believed that their employees were reporting which jurisdictions were the employees working out of. Now, let's look at what was the other side of the coin, which is what actually was the reality. The reality was that only 33% of employees were actually reporting where they were spending time, and that 61% were aware that failing to report days would actually result in tax and other compliance implications. Now, obviously a big gap there between expectation and reality. And then the other thing that we found in the survey was that about a third of the employees, about 30% of the employees actually worked outside of what their HR systems would have as their stated work or home state. So a large part of the population was working in jurisdictions and the employers were expecting to know that, but didn't actually know. Next slide, Holly. Also, if you think about the new world of work, which we are all trying to figure out, and I think that's why we are here, that's why I have Cindy, and I'm really excited to talk about Cindy as to what are the trends that she's seeing as she talks to clients. But at least as we think about sort of the new world of work, some of the themes seem quite clear. So about 90% of employees say that they want to be able to work from wherever they want. I think that's not surprising. Most of us have gotten used to it. Not everybody, but a lot of people think that they don't want to be going back to work 100% of the time. 94% of HR professionals say that remote work actually allows for greater D&I. As we all know, D&I initiatives, big and huge at most corporations. And so actually allowing employees to work from home, fosters more inclusion, more diversity. 83% agreed that teams should be built on experience and not just the location where you may have an office. And 86% of companies expect that they will be getting more requests for remote work. Now, I'd love to see some questions at the end here from the audience or anything differently that you may be doing at your company. But at least this is what we heard from more than 1,000 responders to the survey that we put out there. Holly, next slide. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Cindy to help us understand what does this all mean in terms of how clients are viewing this paradigm shift as it relates to the new form of mobility. Cindy, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So we thought we'd start on our discussion kind of around policy, but start with a look in the past, and let's see what's where we've really come in the past year. So approximately a year ago, many of us went home one day from work and then never went back to the office. For those of us in mobility, like everywhere else, it was a time of change and challenge. We saw international assignees leave their host location, not return to their home location, maybe go to a second home or visit family or something. And for a while, mobility teams couldn't even find them. In the US, in the meantime, transferring employees weren't sure whether they should put their homes on the market and list their homes, because if they did list it, what about showings? And then if you sold your house, what about closings? But, you know, in record time, service providers of all types developed virtual solutions all the way to household good providers. And that was challenging for them, but it's all in the past now. So some policy adjustments we saw were made, things like extensions of temporary living while people were deciding whether they would market their homes or not. Internationally, allowances might have been stopped at a certain point. But again, this was all temporary, and what we found was in supporting employees through the pandemic from a mobility standpoint, exceptions kind of ruled the day. There was just a point where most companies who had people in transit someplace were just ruling by exception, and that's really what worked and got us through it. So, what seems to have changed permanently was that mobility teams with such expertise in logistical management were invited to partner and, in some cases, even take the lead with their colleagues in their organizations to work through remote work and the way it has been done over the past year. Next slide, please. So now we're a year later, and corporations have found that remote work was a success, mostly a success, not only for the organization, but also for employees. Although work-life balance, stress, mental health are still factors that organizations have at top of mind, solutions are being found for those to help employees to deal with the remoteness of the work that they're doing. Although some businesses decided to continue with a remote work model, and your organization may be one of them, really only a few have put policy and process into place yet. Most organizations are still trying to determine the approach that they want to take post-pandemic. So today, we'll discuss policy considerations and development we've seen some companies begin to take to lay out a sort of blueprint for the future of work in their organizations. Before we start, let me just define a distributed workforce. It is defined as a workforce that is geographically dispersed over a wide area and can be domestic or international, may have people in offices or not. So can we have the next slide, please? Oh, I'm sorry, no, just keep it there for a second, I'm sorry. Okay, as we look at remote work, the first consideration that we want to make is whether there are job roles that cannot be done remotely. If you're still going to have offices, well, then perhaps those folks can go back to the office when the time is right. If you are not going to keep your real estate, then you are going to need to determine where people will go who are not going to be in a job where they can work remotely. There's many variables, as I noted on the slide here under remote work, that need to all be considered. And we know that for organizations, there's no one solution that's going to fit all as we move forward with policy. Each organization is too unique and has too many differences to be able to have a single solution. What we do know, though, to be critical is a well thought out communications plan and appropriate technology that's going to support a dispersed workforce. Each organization will have to determine how much flexibility they offer, and this is around, full-time remote work from home or temporary, or maybe a couple of days in the office and a couple of days at home. Again, an organization has to look at all of their job roles and determine what's going to be right for each job that they have in their organization. So in order to start really planning what your process is going to be and what kind of a policy you're going to write, the best thing to do And we're seeing this is mostly done as an HR initiative, but in some cases we know that mobility managers are taking a lead role, if not a lead role, at least a key role in working on these policies. And then all these other groups that I mentioned need to be considered as well. I may have even left one or two out, but mostly it's all the primary departments in any type of an organization. You want them all to be involved, because when you have a remote workforce or a distributed workforce, everybody's going to be impacted by that. So they all should have a say in how you move forward. And corporate culture, I can't say enough about the impact corporate culture has on this type of a decision, because it's impacting the entire organization. So as a policy is being developed and an approach is being developed in your organization, you want to test corporate culture all along the way. So make sure that as you're going through what you're working on, if you're, whatever it might be that you're looking at, does it fit our corporate culture? And if it doesn't, is there a new normal that we need to introduce? And how do we then merge that within our corporate culture? Okay, so next slide, please. So as the project team builds the plan, it should address employees, HR, and business needs. And you want to ensure that it's in alignment, whatever you decide and whichever way you move forward, is that it's in alignment with your business strategy for, remote workforce, a distributed workforce, or a hybrid model where there's office and home time. So again, these are some of the many variables you're going to need to decide on as you move forward. If you're going to put a duty of care statement into the policy, it can be thought of as an extension of your company values, and it can include mobility considerations as well. So you can think about the employee's day-to-day responsibilities, but also how your employees travel, how do they access facilities if indeed they're going to facilities, what are the technology concerns, and those may be based on your operating geographies, depending on if you have a region where maybe technology is difficult. Is there something you can do there to help that team or individuals? We're going to discuss assessment of compliance and risk factors in a few minutes. So let's move on to eligibility. As you're putting together your plan, with eligibility, you want to consider job roles again, and who is eligible for remote work, when can they work remotely, who's going to be responsible for approving it and allowing it, and are there benefits that maybe are changing now that people are working remotely? So, of course, is there additional technology support that's needed? What about skills? Is an individual or individuals, are they being impacted and maybe need some language support or cultural training? All of that should be considered. You'll, of course, want an exception process that you're carefully tracking in place. You're going to want to determine approval levels for exceptions as well. And again, training and reskilling programs are important if remote work, is going to require new technology tools, and you're going to want to think about training for leaders. So while everybody did a pretty good job over the last year, again, leaders and managers of people may not really know how to do this appropriately in the long run, so some training might be needed there. And then once a draft plan has been put in place, you're going to want to review it with the entire project team first, because you want everybody in the organization who's been involved to buy off on the final plan. And then from there, create a rollout plan to key stakeholders, and how will you be sharing the information? Will you be doing webinars? Will it all be in writing? How do you want to move forward that way? Lastly, it's important to talk about and think about the reassessing what you've done with the policy. So when will you refine it? How often will you refine it? And who will be involved in that refinement? Again, you're looking at exceptions. You definitely want to pull out the exceptions you've had over, let's say, the last 6 months or year, and see if there's been some that have been repeated time after time, and decide whether or not it should remain an exception or whether it should now become part of the policy. Next slide, please. So from a compliance and risk standpoint, these are some of the assessment pieces that you're going to want to put into your policy. Considering the factors on your screen, what process and tools are you going to use to determine that these types of factors have been considered? And then who are the right people or person to approve each phase as you go through your plan? So part of the policy will be for the teams at large. And then you're going to want to have an assessment plan that really is addressing new people who either come into the organization, new roles that are created, or someone who raises their hand and says, I'd like to now move to another country or another state, depending. So now Nishant will dive a bit deeper into risk for your consideration.
Well, thank you, Cindy. That was really insightful. I appreciate you sharing all of that. Hopefully, this is already turning wheels in some of the audience's minds, and would love to hear follow-up questions that we can shed more light into if there are certain topics that you'd like for us to go into. There's so much to talk about here. But piggybacking on what Cindy just said, we think about risks. There are a number of different types of risks that are arising as a result of these distributed workforces. And these are just a handful of them. They don't even cover the whole plethora of different risks that exist. But just to look at a few, for example, in corporate tax, if you have an employee who normally used to be working in a certain jurisdiction, but has moved cross-border, is now working in a different country on behalf of a legal entity, there's a very real chance, depending on what that individual does, that they could actually create a corporate tax liability in the host jurisdiction unknowingly. Lots of corporate tax, corporate payroll issues. You have people working, whether it's across different state lines, whether it's across different country lines, depending on the treaties, reciprocal arrangements that may or may not exist. You may very well find yourself that a harmless request to work from a different state or a different country may actually be creating some sort of a payroll withholding obligation that both the employee and the employer does not know about, and worse, a taxability event for the employee, which obviously is going to be an unpleasant surprise. There are a number of other factors that affect mobility. For example, immigration is a big one. And especially with the world as it's evolving, we're having more and more closed borders. With Brexit, that's become even a bigger challenge in Europe. So a number of things to think about from a mobility perspective, and then overall from compliance perspective, whether it's duty of care, whether it's IT infrastructure, there's so many different pieces that basically go into this. Now, this has never been easy in the past. Holly, next slide, please. This has never been easy in the past. So, a lot of these conversations historically have happened in the context of business travelers. And I think for the most part, a lot of companies have said, we've got about 2%, 3% of our workforce that's likely traveling enough between different jurisdictions that we really don't need to, have such a big focus on business traveler compliance. What has happened in the last, 15 months or 18 months is that business travel compliance has sort of led into this distributed and remote workforce, where you may have had a small population that was not working in where you thought they would be working and are working in a different jurisdiction. Now that proportion has gone from something like a 3% in today's world, that's probably closer to 80%. But even in a steady state in, let's say, fall of this year or early next year, depending on what policies you guys are putting in place, you could have anywhere between 30 and 50, 60, 70% of your population that is not in the office. Then the question becomes, well, where are they working? And so very quickly, what was a risk, a cross-border risk, which may not have been significant enough for a business travel population, so the fines would not have been big enough, or the tax liability would not have been big enough, suddenly becomes very, very, very big, just because of that shift in the number of people who are no longer in the office and potentially working from another jurisdiction. So this is a map. I think a lot of you may or may not be familiar with it, but what it basically shows is the United States and the different states in the US that have different withholding obligations. So for example, I live in the jurisdiction of New York, but if you had an employee who was, let's say, in Illinois, who traveled to New York and spent more than 14 days in New York, then by law, the company needs to be withholding on their paycheck. Now, the same rule will hold even for an employee who is temporarily living in New York, maybe with their partner or with their family in New York during the pandemic or post-pandemic. And if you continue to capture their withholding in Illinois, then basically you'd be out of compliance with New York. So that's just one example. I always find it sort of easy to be able to talk about this, but this is by no means restricted to here in the US. This is a global issue. If you have people who are going up to Canada or to different countries, then depending on the various treaties that exist between different countries, you may have an obligation. Not only may the employee become taxable, but you as a company may have the obligation to make sure that you are set up to withhold them properly and that you are withholding them properly. So we'll talk about some of the practical implications of that maybe in the Q&A, but that's just one example of that in the US. Holly, next slide, please. And then when we look at things across countries, obviously the picture becomes very, very, very complicated. And so there is no one thing that can now trip you up as an organization if you are having people, live and work across different countries. You have all sorts of implications around corporate taxability or permanent establishment that may get created. You may have implications around personal taxability, withholding, which may be an employer obligation depending on the jurisdiction that you're talking about, social security that you now have to look at, immigration requirements that have to be looked at. In Europe, there's a number of labor law stuff where you may need to do a posted worker notification. You may need to file for an A1 certificate. So it's sort of the list goes on and on and on. The point being that it's not easy to be able to just say, hey, it's easy for some CEOs to jump onto social media and say, hey, we're just going to let people work from anywhere. But it does come with a number of different issues that I think people like you need to think about, at least figure out a path to compliance on the big risk items. Holly, next slide, please. So, how do you actually enable this whole, how do you actually get your arms around all of these? So obviously, we had, Cindy talk a lot from a policy perspective, the things that she's seeing, and, we'll get into a little bit more in the Q&A. I really want to ask Cindy about what kinds of things that she's seeing in the marketplace. So we'll get to that. But I assume that a number of you folks have been working on policies. The other piece of it is once you have a policy in place, how do you actually put a process in place? And then what kind of systems do you need in place, right? So Holly, next slide. One of my favorite stories, more recently is actually this from last week. I was on a call with a company with about 8,000 to 10,000 employees. And last year they said, well, we're starting to have people who are not, who want to go live with a spouse or with a partner or with a family member somewhere else. And, we'll just create sort of a mailbox. We'll create a mailbox for anybody who wants to send in a request that they want to go work from somewhere else. We'll ask them a few questions. We'll track them in an Excel file. What they did not realize that in a time frame of about 8 months, they would get about 1,000 requests. And very quickly, that team got completely overwhelmed by the number of emails that were coming in, each of those, looking at each of those cases, and the number of people internally who needed to be involved with that this almost became a full-time job on its own for multiple functions across multiple departments and multiple people, that it almost became unmanageable. And so that is what we're seeing. I think that was okay for the year 2020 and probably for some part of 2021. But as companies put in place formal policies, whether they look at opening up in the fall of this year after Labor Day, or in February or in January of 2022, I think there will be a need for a well-defined process where you can actually answer the questions around tax and payroll and immigration and technology and facilities and all those other things that you really need to be looking at before you can give somebody the green light, whether they can or cannot actually work remotely, and for how long can they work remotely. Is it just in the US? Can it be global? And all these things sort of ultimately go into that policy, and the policy drives the process, and the process obviously then ideally should be supported by some sort of a system if you don't want to get overwhelmed by just the number of requests that you might get or have already been getting, and how do you manage it. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, I think a lot of companies that I'm talking to are deciding or are putting processes and policies in place that, hey, yes, we'll have a certain set of criteria, and that we will allow people to work from a certain jurisdiction for a certain amount of time. But then who's monitoring that? How do you actually know that if you allowed John Doe to be able to work from the state of New York for the next 3 months, that they're actually back from New York after the 3 months? Who's actually monitoring that? What if they don't come back? The compliance burden still sits on the employer, except that there is no mechanism to actually understand that. So I think there is both parts of it. There's the piece around the pre-approval and getting people to get there and making sure that you as an organization have policies that you can adhere to and can manage in an effective way. And then there's the post piece of it to make sure that once somebody has gone off, similar to probably an assignment, that you are able to manage them post that remote work authorization, and then making sure that you're following through, and that if they need to come back, that they are actually coming back. Next slide, Holly. And so, one of the big pieces of this, obviously, from my perspective, is going to be understanding, where are people and where have they been and where will they be in the future? Because a lot of the compliance actually gets done. You want to be able to manage risk up front, and then you want to make sure that you have enough to be able to ensure that you're able to do compliance looking back, because a lot of the tax compliance, a lot of the payroll compliance, you will need to make sure that you have the data to be able to make the right, take the right tax stance. And so what's interesting is, when we went out, the same survey that I talked to you about at the head of this presentation, we'd asked another set of questions around, okay, you are as an employee, how comfortable are you with employers actually understanding where you are? Because if you are going to ask for that right to be able to go work from anywhere, or want to be able to work in a place which is not your designated place of office, then how comfortable are you? And it was surprising to me that the numbers came out better than what I expected them to. There may be some deviation in this, but nonetheless, I think an overwhelming response here is that it is okay for employees that the employer actually have, at least at the jurisdiction level, where they are, so that the right compliance can be done to protect both the employee as well as the employer. And I think this is critical, and I think this is a big shift from where we used to be, even about 15 months ago, where I think there's a lot more hesitation in the past. But I think as people sort of ask for that right to work remotely, work in a disputed manner, I think that sort of perspective is changing. I think with that, what also changes, Holly, next slide, is the ability to be able to think about what kind of a system you might want to put in place that allows for understanding where the footprint of your employees is and will be, and also to be able to use that as a way of both getting input into, hence, where do you need to do compliance? How do you allow people to go to a certain jurisdiction? In some cases, it's not just one individual that can create compliance issues. Sometimes it's a group of individuals. And so having an understanding of where have people been and where will people be going forward is critical in being able to manage this. And I think depending on, Ollie, next slide, depending on the culture at the firm, depending on the the various program policy that you put in place, it is possible to construct it in a way that allows to meet that balance between privacy as well as between the objectives that you may set out in that policy. And then finally, as I said before, I think it's well and good that a lot of these things were managed in emails and in Excel files in 2020. We were all trying to deal with a lot in 2020 and big part of 2021. But I do think that for you to be able to have an auditable, systematic process that you can defend yourself in an audit, whether it is from a compliance perspective, whether it's from a tax saving perspective, having a system that actually allows for that to happen in a seamless electronic way, I think is going to be critical, because even though email is great, it was really not built to manage workflows. And I think that is the other piece that I think allowing yourself to be able to have that insight and allowing the company to have the auditable trail of information that you will need, I think is going to be critical. And I see a lot of that coming. I think we've seen this in the past years where, whenever you've had jurisdictions, whether it's states, whether it's countries with massive fiscal deficits, they have few tools to basically plug that hole, and audits typically are a big piece of it. So I do expect that 2021, 2022 will see a large number of audits, especially as it relates to cross-border working. Cindy, next slide. I think that sort of is the overview. Cindy and I wanted to keep this to about 30 minutes of us talking and then open it up to questions for the audience. I do have a few questions that have already come in, so maybe I'll get started with that. Cindy, if that's okay with you?
Sure.
Awesome. All right, so I think this is a relevant question that I see a lot of our clients ask as well, is that have you found that in this new norm of remote work, most companies are letting employees live anywhere that they want? Maybe I'll generalize that question that came in to be, so what kinds of policies do you see companies put in place, and sort of what criteria are different companies using to choose what policy is best for them?
So I know what, Nishant, what I would say is that, I don't think any, or most, let me say most companies that we've been dealing with, that their intent is to let people live anywhere. That is not something most corporations who are relocating people on a regular basis and stuff would want to do. I think everybody knows enough about compliance to not want that to happen. However, I think, as you've shown, there are times when you don't know that they're moving about. I think that's the critical piece, and getting your arms around that is going to be difficult. So there has to be something in written policy that will address that, so that people know that that will not be acceptable, because otherwise you are putting yourself at risk as a corporation.
And are you seeing that? So, it's interesting you say that, right? But I have seen, for example, the CEO of Salesforce, he publicly, I think it was on Twitter, where he said, well, the daytime work is dead and people can basically work from anywhere. So, there are companies that are out there who just, Twitter, I think Jack Dorsey's made some statements like that. So, I'm curious to hear from your perspective, if you were a company where you had a CEO who basically publicly go out and say something like that, what do you think, the folks who are in the day-to-day compliance, what do you think they're doing?
Panicking? Is that the right answer? I honestly, I don't know. I know that the organizations that I've talked to, that is not being said. But if a CEO does say something like that, then it's really important that corporate HR have a discussion with the CEO to the best of their ability, of course, about why that's not a great thing to say.
Right. And then are you seeing, the restrictions that your clients are putting, is that mostly, US centric? Is it global? What are you seeing there?
I'm sorry, I think I missed the beginning of what you asked.
No, the question I was asking was, the restrictions that, companies are putting in place. Do you typically find companies more open to allowing remote or distributed workforce, in the US, like you can go work from a different state and that's okay, but you can't go international? Are you seeing more around like, okay, if you want to go international, here's a list of countries that you can go to? Any insight into what you've seen from your clients?
So I do think that, if someone says, this is my opportunity, I've always wanted to live in a warmer climate and I'm going to go down south. I think in the US, people are maybe a little bit more open to it, but I would say also companies are becoming savvy enough that they know they really need to have an entity in that state. And if they don't, they might be putting themselves at risk. Right.
I'm getting some really interesting comments, and I'll read without necessarily attributing it to anybody. I'll read the comment. And I quote unquote, the topic of news announcements for companies allowing employees to work from anywhere is a very hot topic. We continue to battle the message internally to let employees know that it is not realistic for us, and we are certain there is fine print, quote unquote, in these grand CEO announcements. So that's really interesting. I think to your point, that most companies are having a hard time, firefighting these things. Actually, I borrowed the word firefighting from another comment that I got, which I'll read out. At the moment, we are in caps. It writes, not allowing to work somewhere other than the employment country. We are firefighting, smiley, trying to fix cases that came to light. Very interesting. Yeah. So, I
do think that in most organizations, certainly moving from country to country, I think organizations are especially aware of the danger there. But I do think the idea of somebody moving from state to state in some organizations might be allowed more readily than an organization that is, knowledgeable about compliance.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? Because theoretically, and I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here because I want to sort of prompt you to help suss out a conversation here. But theoretically, most companies have had mobility departments. You guys you work with hundreds, not thousands of companies that have mobility departments that have been moving people around between different countries for decades. And so why is that such a big deal?
Why is it such a big deal to allow it?
Yeah, why is it such a big deal? I'm obviously being tongue-in-cheek here, but I'm just to be able to suss out the magnitude of the issue here. Why is it such a big deal? Mobility departments have been moving people between countries for years.
Well, and I think that's what companies recognize, is that if mobility does it, then they're making sure that everything is checked off and done properly and in a compliant, risk-averse way. And that does not necessarily happen when it's an individual doing it.
Yes, no, I think that is right. Which actually brings me to another question that I see here, which is, from your experience, as you think about, compliance around, this whole remote and distributed, who's owning these processes internally at companies? What have you seen from your experience? Is there a single owner? Is there multiple owners? How are companies organizing themselves to deal with?
For the most part, we're seeing remote work and developing these policies as HR initiatives, for the most part. However, in some organizations, finance plays a big role in that as well. And in some cases, finance runs it. So it just really depends on the organization and kind of who controls what in an organization. But certainly if HR if it's an HR initiative, we are definitely seeing mobility very, very much a part of it, whether it's in just an active role or whether it's actually leading the initiative.
Have you actually seen companies create the new roles to be able to deal with this, given how cross-functional, given the cross-functional nature of this challenge? And if yes, then where have those reporting lines been?
Yeah, and that's why, as I was talking about policy, I was mentioning having, you know, a project team comprised of all the different roles, because it is going to have an impact on everybody. And so therefore everybody needs to be involved to some degree.
Right. Yeah, and that makes so much sense here. Yeah, and you know, in my own work, you know, as I've talked to companies, I've seen the same thing. I think, you know, it's very interesting. I've been doing business travel compliance for about a decade now, and for the most part of that decade, I think most people, you know, sort of nobody really wanted to own business travel. Depending on the organization, it would live somewhere between tax, in many cases, to you know, sometimes in payroll, where you know the payroll obligations, especially U.S. state to state, were fairly large, or where they've been through audit, and sort of it had hit payroll hard. But there had really never been an owner. But this is the first time that I am you know, actually seeing that companies are actually creating a dedicated role to be able to manage the complexity that comes with it. Because I think the companies are recognizing that you can no longer deal with this by just making this sort of a second job for somebody. And so I think that's one of the key critical organizational changes that I'm seeing. Most typically, I'm seeing that roll up into HR, which does not necessarily mean that HR has to be responsible. HR is ultimately hence responsible, but they do pull in, Cindy, to your point, you know, they are banking on sort of expertise from tax and from payroll and from mobility and from, you know, all sorts of other functions internally, whether it's IT and security and everybody else. So very, very interesting change that I have experienced for the first time in the 10 years that I have been doing this. I have another question here from Alex, who says, have you seen US state governments updated to catch up to what is happening now tax-wise? And he says in brackets, thinking about New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, what do you expect to see as auditing measures and consequences? I don't know. Did you want to take that, Cindy? I'm obviously, you know, I'm happy to chat.
No, I have not seen anything at all about that topic. So no, you can take it, Nishant.
Yeah, no, happy to talk about it. You know, I've been following this space, as I said, for about 10 years. And I'll say that, you know, it's very interesting. So you specifically asked about the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, and I'm sure you've seen the dispute between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Right now, New Jersey is not very happy with New York. If you go talk to New Jersey, they will tell you that they feel like they've been funding New York schools for a while, because New York has had this convenience rule, you know, for many, many years. If you are a New York-based employee who, for convenience, worked out of New Jersey, then New York said, well, you still owe me the employment taxes. And I think New Jersey for a really long time sort of said, okay, fine, you know, being in the New York area contributes to our sort of overall, you know, economy. And so that's fine. But, you know, once the pandemic hit, I think it was largely unexpected that New York would hold on to the convenience rule. And I think there is a lot of dispute there. I think that is going to probably become a part of, you know, an accelerating dispute. I know from talking to folks in New Jersey, they're not willing to let this go. But for the time being, unfortunately, if you are a New Jersey resident who works in New York, even though because of pandemic, you don't want to take the train in, you still have to have your New York taxes withheld. And at least in the New York area, that is not going away. I have somebody who wants an opportunity to talk, and I'm sure we can Hey, Holly, is it possible to let one of our participants who wants to share a story?
Let me just see if I can set that up. 1 second.
Yeah, we have Rosalba who wants to speak. So I don't know if there's a way to unmute them.
You should be unmuted now.
Can you hear me? Hello,
Yeah.
everybody. Hi, I'm Rosalba Bol Rinaldi, from Switzerland. I'm working as a global mobility manager within Cofra Holding, which is a Swiss-based holding, but we have a lot of businesses worldwide. One of the most common you might heard about is C&A. Maybe it's a retail, but we have also investment banking. We have real estate companies. We have solar, a new acquirement, which is solar panels, a company. We have a lot of charities, so philanthropies. And from my side, what I can share with you is we have seen this major problem with cases where we did not, or we were not allowed aware, or HR was not aware that people were working from Bali or from South Africa or Australia or whatever, without any work permit, without anything. And we are firefighting, that was my comment at the moment, just to resolve those cases, bring them back home. And we have now launched a statement just from the holding to all the businesses that we will not allow to work from somewhere else than the employment country, just because we face so many, you touched them, permanent establishment, payroll, immigration, all this kind of problems. And we are looking actually in this year, one of our objectives is to set up work strategies. But as you said, there is no one fits all solution, because I said we have different kind of businesses. We have also finance regulated businesses. And it's quite hard because this means that we are a group of 3 persons within our holding that are dealing with global mobility. And we are a so-called subject matter expert team. So we are familiar with all this tax, social security, corporate tax, everything. And so we are like a big 4 within our company. And I was wondering if you have, well, of course, if you have seen already companies with or holdings like we are, because it's not, we are not a headquarter. So, and we have not only one nature of business, we have different kind of nature of business, how others approach these issues. I mean, it's really like we need maybe to reach out to each business CEO, and like what you have mentioned, to have a group who works on it. This means for us, we are in the lead, but we will have like maybe 10 groups who need to work on it, because we have 10 different kind of companies within our holding. Any idea or suggestion how we could deal and be more efficient in the short-term time?
I guess one of my questions would be, do you have a leader of the whole organization? Do you have I don't know if it's CEO or something like somebody like a CEO?
Yes, of course. Yeah, we have. Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps your team can compose something that CEO can send out to all the groups, CEOs, saying this needs to be cascaded through the organization. It will not, it is not acceptable, and then have some sort of, what will happen to an employee if an employee does it going forward. And if someone in the organization, whichever organization approves it, what would be, what would be the ramification if they approve somebody going to Bali to work? That I would imagine if it came from your CEO, you could, as I said, you or somebody on your team could write it. But if the CEO is willing to send it under his or her name, then that would obviously get the attention, I would guess, of the other CEOs.
Yeah. Yeah, this is certain. You know, like we have one of our investment companies. They have quite really senior people, huh? And they have a lot of US citizens, but the company sits in Jersey, in UK. And you know, like they said, yeah, we have done a risk assessment, that's a really low risk, you know. So yeah, for us it's difficult then from the global mobility. Yeah, as you said, maybe then we need to go back to the CEO of our holding and say, hey, we have, you know, like we need to be compliant, and we need to be also we have to treat all the employees of all companies within our holding in the same way. Be consistent with the policy, because this is exactly the problem. If we start to do exceptions for everybody, then it becomes, you know, then the best policy does not really help, because yeah, if you have not the top the top executives who stand behind it, then yeah, we have seen in the past, I mean, we have global mobility policies, we have a lot of things, but if the top executives are not informed and not trained to understand it, then it does not help to have a policy, being honest.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Rosalba, if I may add two things that I've sort of, for my own conversations of the last many months. So two things. One, you know, really it is a very cultural thing, right? I have worked with companies which are sort of group holding companies, right? Where every company sort of operates independently. And, you know, that in some cases, you know, there's a certain culture around organizations like that, right? In some cases, you're able to have a centralized shared services like policy, shared services policies that are central, that basically can be replicated in multiple different companies.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you know, in companies that have that kind of culture, you can go to the CEO and have that conversation. But if the company culture does not, if the group culture does not allow for it, then this will not be an exception. And so in those companies, it is just the reality that every company will just go do what they have to do on their own, and then you have to find sort of local ownership in each of those companies. So I think it's very driven by the company culture and what is acceptable and what's not, and that depends on who owns ultimately this thing. Which brings me to my second point. You know, a lot of times, you know, this is being viewed as a compliance thing. And even though it is a compliance thing at the heart of it, but really it is a people thing, right? And if you think about the CEO, as Cindy mentioned, right? I mean, going to the CEO, if you think about the CEO's number one job, it is people. And, you know, so depending on, you know, what policy you end up creating can actually make the company either more friendly or less friendly from a people perspective, which will, you know, then affect the competitiveness for talent in the marketplace, which will impact the, you know, the ability to be able to retain people depending on which side of the spectrum you end up or not. And I think that's why, you know, something like this, that, you know, it's not hard to foresee why, you know, the CEO cannot be, you know, can have oversight on something like that, especially in an organization like yours. But I think you've got to change the conversation from it to be compliance to being one of around people, and, you know, competitiveness around people. Okay. Zalba, did you want to add anything else there? I mean, anything that you want to share with the group based on your experience of doing the firefighting? You know, now that you've been going through this process, anything, any words of wisdom or any learnings that you can share with this group?
Is that for me? I'm sorry, Nishant.
No, that was for Zalba, because she's been firefighting.
Okay.
Anything to share with her peers.
Thank you. No, I think what at least we got now is that we have the HR business partners of the different. Oh, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Sorry. Yeah. No. At least we have now the HR business partners of the different businesses behind us. I have prepared everything, and what we decided to do is that we leave we will prepare a package to them, a briefing package, and they will approach their business leaders, so their CEO, and we start with that, at least for the moment. And I think we wait for the feedback. This should be now in May. We will prepare everything, and then as of May, they will start to communicate to their CEOs. And I think this is already a good start in sense of that the CEOs of the business are aware of the problems. And I think you said, yeah, it's about people. That's correct. It is about people. But it is also a lot about compliance. At least within Europe, we have, I mean, it's maybe different. It's not really different as in the States, but within Europe, you know, the borders are so close, and people are moving so fast from one country to another, and that's and the laws are so different from each country. You know, even if it's 200 kilometers from Switzerland, you are in a complete different kind of jurisdiction, and you know, like the issues are too big. The risks are too high, so we need really to be a bit more restrictive. And we understand that, you know, also the younger generation, I think they would like to have more freedom to work from wherever they want. But it depends also on the business that you choose to work in, and that's a bit also the problem. You know, so people need also to understand that if they want to go financial way, you cannot work from, I don't know, from Bali or from Chile, or you know what I mean. So you need to be in the country where your company sits.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a true restrictive view. I think with philanthropy it's a bit different. But the nature of the business is really like giving also a bit the framework of where remote working is possible or not.
Yeah, well, Rosalba, thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
You know, it's very interesting. Bali comes up in almost every call. For whatever reason, people from every company seem to be ending up in Bali. It's really funny. Okay, well, great. We had, you know, I think we had a question around if we will be sharing slides and recording. I think Holly.
Yes, so we will be sharing the slides and recording shortly after this session. We just need to wait for everything to convert over, and then I'll send it out to everyone who joined. But otherwise, thank you so much to Cindy and Nishant for taking us through that session. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you do have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.